Thank you all for coming. So as Pamela mentioned, we started talking in 2014 when I was working on a thesis project in my journalism minor. And I'll talk about this for a second just because it kind of, it begins, it's the beginning of like this lineage of work that I'm still following now. At the time I was looking into a gallery in Halifax called the Multicultural Art Resource Center, which was the only space in Halifax that exhibited and supported BIPOC artists. And I came across it because I read a piece that Pamela wrote about it.
I worked there, yes.
and you were the only person also who wrote a review of an exhibition that happened there. And so I was like, wait a minute, this sounds very significant. Why haven't I heard of this? Why hasn't it been documented really in any way? The answer to that is quite simple, really. But at the time I began to, this was in 2013, 2014, and so it's kind of like the beginning of this, of what we've come to see as this like increasing, you know, so-called inclusion that we've been seeing over the past couple of years. And at the time I was interested in identifying how funding structures that purported to support work by BIPOC artists were sustainable or not, and if their initiatives lasted beyond, you know, Black History Month or you know, whatever flavor of the month might have given them the occasion to support these practices. And so when I spoke with Pamela, even in 2014, we were already kind of talking about this gap between the proclamation to support and, you know, the reality of it. And I distinctly recall you telling me that you felt that there's a kind of, you know, dearth of taking seriously the practices of Black and racialized artists because they were kind of seen as you know, only worthy of supporting because diversity was in. And of course, these terms are quite simple and reductive. So I'll give that, you know, I'll just place that in an asterisk for a moment, and it's something we can revisit later. But so this research started in 2014. I wrote this piece that was for a J school like feature writing class or something like that, and it came out of like you know, like a desire for me to really figure out what was going on there. And then when I started working at Canadian Art, these questions still continued to inform my writing. And so that's kind of like that's one of the sort of underlying currents that that I guess, or maybe I'm very bad with metaphors and idioms. Something about like, you know, I'm trying to say that like the seed was sown at the time, and then it came to, you know, fruition all this time later. But really but the research that more directly informed this issue started for me in 2017 when I found a painting of a lynching in the National Gallery of Canada's collection. And it was in March 2017, around the same time that the Dana Schutz debates were raging. So just quick refresher, a white artist painted Emmett Till's open casket, and this painting was included in the Whitney biennial, and huge debates were raging around white artists' entitlement to depict Black pain and Black death. And so I came across this painting at exactly that time and tracked it in the National Gallery's collection. Found out that it had been exhibited until as recently as summer 2016, and interviewed a curator there about, you know, what it meant that painting was shown until so recently. Was able to have like a quite open and honest conversation with him, where he was just like, well, you know, I don't really know what to do with this painting. Like, we put it away because we've reinstalled the gallery, but you know, this connects actually to a conversation that I was just having with Pamela about the renaming of artworks or the kind of the concealing of sordid histories in a way. And so he was like, well, if we don't show it, then that's kind of like denying that we have this painting, but we have to admit that we have it. And, but at the same time, it's problematic that it's one of the only representations of black people in the gallery at this time. And then I began to research the National Gallery's acquisitions policies, because I went to an exhibition there just shortly after I came across this painting. And this exhibition was the first part of the reinstallation of their permanent collection, which positioned Indigenous art alongside Canadian art in the same gallery for the first time since 2003. But really the tradition had been to segregate Indigenous art from Canadian art in the permanent collection galleries. And in this exhibition, I noticed that, I'll say that this exhibition was opened in Canada 150, and so the backdrop for this is this time when the country, or some of it, and its art institutions are reconsidering lineages of colonialism and violence, and how they continue to manifest in collections, in institutions, in exhibitions, in hiring structures. And just walking through this exhibition, I noticed that Stan Douglas was the only Black Canadian artist in this entire rehang. And when I interviewed the CEO of the gallery at the time to ask him about this, he said to me something to the tune of, after having claimed that the goal for this reinstallation is to correct the story of art making in Canada and to retell Canadian art history in a way that includes artists that had previously been marginalized. And so when I asked him about this, he was like, well, what's the point of showing second-rate work that nobody can understand? And so I was like, well, what about, like, are you thinking about how to sustain these changes past this moment? Like, how does your policy reflect them? And the policy doesn't reflect those concerns at all, which got me to think about how momentary or fleeting this window dressing might be. And so it was at that time really that I started to think about, like, especially in 2017 when it seemed like so much was shifting. I mean, we're seeing just in terms of, like, just quantitatively, we're seeing more Black, Indigenous, people of color artists exhibiting than, I will not say than ever before, but in my time on this earth. I don't think it was something that had really happened, and we're seeing more BIPOC in institutional positions, and we're seeing more BIPOC publishing and so forth. And so there's this, we can agree that there's this increased visibility, however complicated that might be, but at the same time, people were starting to ask, well, how is this going to last after 150? Like, what are the, what's the guarantee that this is going to last past this moment? And actually, this question is central to the issue following ownership, which we're putting to bed, like, literally right now. That's supposed to come out in 2 weeks on Deja Vu, which takes up this question of what happens after these watershed historical moments when, these so-called records of diversity, like of, the first ever so-and-so or the only so-and-so to take a position or to be exhibited or whatever. What happens after these moments, and how can they be structurally sustained? And so when I came to conceive of ownership, and I will say, actually, Pamela, of course, won't take credit for this, but she's the one who, she's on C's editorial advisory board, and she was the one who suggested the name of the issue. So thank you for that. And so when I went about making this issue, I wanted to be like, I wanted it to be very like I was thinking about collections. Like the backdrop is kind of like, you know, as I'm saying, these claims of increased visibility and questions of their sustainability and so forth. But I thought of the collection as the site, the specific site to take up for that question, because it's the only place really that, or not the only place, but I thought that the collection was a way to examine how, and I talk about this in the editorial note. It has implications for an artist's career that their work is collected. It has implications on how they're historicized. It has implications on how their work enters into dialogue with other works in the collection, which is significant considering that collections, as we've already established, are inherently essentially a colonial exercise. And so when I was thinking about how to approach this issue, I wanted to take a kind of, like, I wanted to, you know, take this sort of like hyper-specific focus, but to sort of approach it from a couple of different angles. So of course, repatriation is a big question in that, in this time when we're talking about restitution and the sort of, you know, very concerted you know, a conversation that is gaining momentum worldwide about returning stolen cultural materials to their rightful owners, and what it, you know, what that means, how it can be done. I'm just checking for time. Okay. So I'll start talking about some of the content in the issue. I think maybe, I feel like I've kind of laid the groundwork for what I was thinking, and then I just want to make sure to have time for us to tease apart some of these things that I've put forth. And so on the note of repatriation, I asked artist Adrian Simpson, who's from Siksika Nation, to contribute a piece about his time in politics in the 90s when he was working on repatriation efforts, and at a time when that conversation was kind of, you know, and I'll say that it's always risky, and I've learned this the hard way. To say that like this thing or this conversation is unprecedented because everything has already happened before. It's just, you know, perhaps unprecedented that it's documented as thoroughly or as vigorously as it is now, or that it has the visibility that it does now. And so Adrian Simpson worked on repatriation efforts in the 90s. Throughout the 90s, he was in office, I think from 90 or 91 to about 98, if memory serves me correct. And so he talks about how when he was in that position, he went on these sort of these trips to the Shoreditch. Where's that? The British Museum, which of course I'm pretty sure the British Museum has like the highest concentration of stolen cultural materials in the whole world. And so, you know, he visits their storage facilities and he finds that so many of the stolen indigenous objects are, well, I shouldn't say objects actually, and I'll explain that in a moment, are housed in like totally abominable conditions. So, you know, the materials are kind of like kept in Ziploc bags, or when they're exhibited, they're put in vitrines, as is the convention to display historical materials, even though they're not only meant to breathe, but they're originally meant to be used in ceremony. And so to display these materials in vitrines essentially kills them. And I'll explain that he doesn't refer to, you know, let's say headdresses or ceremonial materials as objects, because they're essentially living things. They're living beings, and so this what I really loved about Adrian's piece is that it calls into question the kind of the ways in which colonial exhibiting tactics or conventions, rather, essentially undermine the sovereignty of indigenous cultural belongings, and so he advocates, in the piece, he advocates for the importance for these materials to return to their rightful owners. Some of these materials are so sacred that like not even anyone in any nation could handle them. Like the people who are equipped to handle them are people who are sort of chosen. But then he talks about how there are no real policies to support the viability of repatriation efforts in Canada, and this question of policy brings me to Jamie Isaac's piece, who's a curator at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, and she talks about how when she started at the WAG in 2016 as the Indigenous curator in residence, she put forth a set of recommendations for the gallery to diversify its collection based on having studied, done like kind of like hardcore statistical study of the collection, and found that I can't remember the numbers exactly, but that the number of works by First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous artists were abysmal relative to how many, relative to Winnipeg's, especially Winnipeg's populations of Indigenous peoples, right? Like if a collection is supposed to reflect the population that it claims to cater to, then how does it get off on that kind of like representational dearth? And so she made acquisitions recommendations for the gallery. In the piece, she talks about how many collections or many museums or collecting institutions haven't had Indigenous curators, which is how you could explain that absence in their collections. And I think the same is true also for Black and POC, the Black and POC curator absence in collecting institutions, with few exceptions, of course, and of course they're always just the exceptions. But yeah, she kind of, one of the sort of undertones in her piece is this concern with the sustainability of this work that she's been doing. Like she talks about how, well, like when I'm not here anymore, when for whatever reasons the priorities of the leadership changes, then who's going to ensure that this continues to happen? And this for me is a point of intersection in my interests with Jamie's, where I've come to believe that unless inclusion, for better or for worse, and for all the complications of that term, unless it's mandated by policy, then there's no guarantee that it'll be instituted past the interests of whoever's in charge, past the interests of whatever the contemporary moment is. And on the asterisk on moment, the New York Times just published this like fucking awful article a couple of days ago about how Black art is having its moment, and it's like, yeah, the way that you I won't talk about that because I could anyway, but I think you get where I'm going with that. And this is also this is something that Tiana Reid takes up in a kind of like from a different angle. I approached her. She's a writer based in New York, and I had worked with her before. And I approached her with a very problematic proposition to take up this question, which is we've been seeing increased representation of Black American artists in the market. Why haven't we been seeing that matched in Canada? And so she first of all problematizes that comparison because it's apples and oranges here in terms of demographics, in terms of obviously in terms of the market, like we don't have a market to the same extent that the U.S. does. I would have really loved to be here for Kenneth Montague's talk. I wonder how he would have addressed that. Yeah, and she wrote her piece in the time that this issue was in production was in June, July, and around the time that she wrote her piece, the Whitney biennial was circulating in the press. And this year's Whitney biennial, I mean, of course, it's controversial every single time, but this year's was controversial because so there's a moment of people kind of praising it for being again diverse in an unprecedented way, that there are more women and POC artists than ever before, and at the same time, people were calling out that one of the members of the Whitney's board is a warlord, basically, and so critics started talking about what it meant for us to be celebrating increasing representation within these structures that are already so deeply fucked up, and so Tiana's piece kind of reflects that concern. And I mean, she does it in a way that I think is really eloquent and that reflects her own ambivalence towards that question. I will say that, I mean, because I have sort of earmarked to this question of the first one or the only one or whatever, and this is also something that is coming up in the Déjà Vu issue and something that is springing from conversations that I've had with Pamela, who was interviewed by Tiana for this piece. Tiana at one point in the piece talks about how she takes the AGO as kind of the Art Gallery of Ontario as this example of a site where we haven't as a place where we might not be seeing this increased representation in the same ways we're seeing it maybe in like smaller galleries. And she states that Mickalene Thomas and Wangechi Mutu were the only Black women to have had exhibitions there, and then I erroneously edited the piece to state that Sandra Brewster's at that time forthcoming exhibition Blur was the first exhibition by a Black Canadian woman at the AGO, which turned out to be false. And in the conversations around the implications of that historical erasure, I began to question what it meant that we were always rushing to celebrate the first or the only one, and whose interests it really serves, and that was a particularly kind of sensitive spot. Isn't really, or something close to me as a person of color who's been on the inside of several institutions as a sort of first, and I've like before I proclaim that I will fact check it, but it's of course, I mean, it's like, why do I need to state that? Like, why does it, like, I don't really know how to I don't have an answer for that. I think maybe the individuals actually that'll get off on a whole other thing, so but we could come back to it in the Q&A if people are interested in taking it up. I wanted to produce these issues just to kind of like push pause for a second, which is convenient because it's print, and to put forth these issues as a way to be like, hey, I think maybe we need to think about how we're having these conversations about diversity and inclusion, and like, let's just like pause for a second and take stock of like this moment, a couple of years into what has felt like this, increasing momentum and, and I mean, we've already been seeing white backlash against it and all of this. Like, let's pause for a second to really like look at what's going on here and how we're talking about it and how we're historicizing it.